best way to grow muscle mass isn't to play competitive football. It's to train like a bodybuilder. Do our football players muscular? Yes, but it's not their primary goal. You need to be on a systematic program if you really want to do this. My name is Davidson, and my background is that I have a master's degree in strength and conditioning and a Ph.D. in exercise physiology. I've worked as a college professor in exercise science and kinesiology departments. I have a long history of athletics, competing in mixed martial arts as well as strongman. Trained with scientific principles of strength and conditioning for decades now at this point. Worked with clients for a number of years. And I'm the author of 3 different books, 2 of them that are training books, the third one that's a biomechanics-based model book for training. Continue to be active as someone that presents and writes and participates in the overall training community. And you know, I intend to do this for the rest of my life and contribute as much as I can to the collective body of knowledge. The main principles for any kind of training goal are always going to be specificity, overload, individual differences, and reversibility. So specificity means that if you have to do exactly the thing to lead you to the goal. If you want to grow muscle mass, you probably shouldn't play golf. You need to lift relatively heavy weights, getting very close to failure, and essentially do more of that over time for the specific muscles that you're looking to target, train, and develop. Overload means that you have to work hard enough to actually threaten the body to a degree where it responds so that it's less threatening to receive the same exposure in the future. Individual differences refers to the fact that everyone has their unique genetic code, and some people are going to have higher ceilings than others. And so it's not all fair and equal. We could be on the same training program and have vastly different results by doing the same exact thing. And reversibility means that if you stop doing something, you're going to ultimately regress and lose the gains that you made if you don't continue to push forward or at least maintain where you were. So for beginners, they ultimately probably have a lower floor for what would be needed to actually create responses. In some ways, almost anything works for beginners. And where beginners can make mistake is thinking that that which is working for them in the beginning will continue to be the thing that drives them forward consistently after that. You ultimately have more room for error as a beginner. You can do a number of things in a suboptimal manner and still be experiencing practically optimal results. Whereas as you become closer and closer towards, your potential, you have to do more and more things really well to continue to go forward. You have to continue to dial in your training approach, your nutrition approach, your sleep and lifestyle approach more and more as you continue to get better. So, beginners oftentimes kind of come in with the special snowflake problem of thinking that they're somehow very different than other Homo sapiens. But for the most part, there's very clear and obvious scientific principles that actually are associated with being able to create the body composition changes associated with growing muscle mass or losing fat, which are typically the 2 things that ride together as the primary goals that people have with their training for general fitness and aesthetic goals that they might have. When we're talking about growing muscle tissue, there are some very specific kind of constraints that you have to fall inside of to be doing that which is necessary to create the adaptation that you're saying you want. And they're fairly broad in some ways. It has to be specific training. So when I say specific, there is essentially 2 kind of landmark places from a how heavy a weight you should be lifting perspective that would tell you whether or not you're using appropriate loading to be able to actually create the stimulus of making yourself grow muscle tissue. It's ultimately, it seems to be between 30% and 85% of your 1 rep max that are the two end points at the low end and the heavy end as that which would be appropriate for growing muscle tissue. If you're below 30%, it's probably just not heavy enough to actually be able to challenge your muscle tissue enough to be able to actually grow it. Like, you essentially can't just bench press number 2 pencils for reps until, you know, that's just not quite enough of a stimulus to be able to reach the threshold level. And then once we get above and beyond 85%, it's a bit too heavy to be able to practically use to be able to create enough stimulus and volume to really promote a hypertrophy response. So as long as you're between 30% and 85% of the weight that you could lift for one, you're in a zone where you can literally have kind of equal muscle growth responses. And that's an incredibly broad place, which leads you to be able to train for sets of anywhere between like 5 or 6, all the way up to 30, 40 reps, something in that area. And if you try hard within the sphere of sets in any of those places, you are doing what you need to do to be able to create the stimulus that you want for the adaptation that you're saying you're looking for. That's like specificity. You have to work with loads between that place. Beyond that, there's also kind of like these things that you have to be aware of how many sets or how much total work do I have to do with weight that's between these two places of 30 and 85%. And that's a bit of a moving target in some ways. The Renaissance periodization guys, Mike Israetel, they have what are referred to as volume landmarks. And their big volume landmarks are maintenance volume, minimum effective volume, maximum adaptive volume, and maximum recoverable volume. And what those things kind of mean is that there's enough volume of sets of 30 to 85% that would allow you to simply keep the muscle mass that you have and not lose it, but neither gain it either. That's maintenance. Then once we reach minimum effective volume, that is the least amount that you could possibly be doing that's actually going to cause you to be growing. Then on the far end is this maximum recoverable volume, where if I do any more than that, I'm actually going to start breaking myself down and losing muscle tissue. And the maximum adaptive volume is going to be like, what is the absolute perfect sweet spot that would cause me to grow muscle mass at the highest rate I possibly could? And what you would try to do from a programming perspective, if you're actively trying to grow a specific muscle, is you train it, and it's kind of like you put together an 8-week plan, and you'd probably start approaching, you'd try to be starting at minimum effective volume, and you'd gradually increase the amount of sets and reps and weight that you're doing with those exercises until you probably get close to maximum recoverable volume, at which point you'd back off, you'd give yourself a little bit of a break, and you'd kind of repeat the same process, maybe with slightly different exercises or a slightly different approach in terms of the overall design of the regimen that you're going to put together for your next planned attack. But those are some of the really primary kinds of big picture pieces that you would consider when you're trying to think about how to design an exercise regimen for growing muscle mass. So there's a few variables that you'd have to consider to be able to really promote specificity and overload, okay? Frequency is one of those variables. The variables that you'd have to consider are load, reps, sets, and then ultimately frequency. But all of those 4 things factor into what you would call volume, okay? And volume seems to be the primary thing that you try to manipulate to be able to grow muscle tissue. And again, like, the volume fits into one of those 4 realms of maintenance, minimum effective, maximum adaptive, and maximum recoverable. So I can play with any of those other ones, the load, the sets, the reps, the frequency, to be able to try to dial myself into any, like, the appropriate place along there. And really when it kind of comes down to like where you are as a trainee with your exercise history and your training age as to how much frequency you may or may not be able to handle, as well as the individual differences that play into who you are as a person and your lifestyle. So, you know, when we talk about beginners, most beginners do really well with 2 sessions a week, quite honestly. And we'll see slightly more growth out of them with adding a third or fourth, but it begins to become this very diminishing return, okay? So typically for beginners, as long as they're getting, and look, like, I don't, like, for the specific number of sets per muscle group per week, you know, there's some pretty good ideas about how much you need to be doing to be able to create growth. You know, probably somewhere between 10 and 20 sets per week per muscle group is an appropriate amount of volume to be able to grow that tissue. And now it's just a question of like, how many times a week do I have to work out for a specific muscle group to be able to accumulate that 10 to 20 sets? With personal training, for instance, oftentimes you're locked into an hour-long session with a client. And if that's the case, there's only so much you can do in an hour. Versus if I'm training someone on my own or there's no time limit, I might be able to get a lot more in per session. Some people train twice a day because they just do better with shorter sessions, or their life and their work schedule and other things just feed into them being able to do it in those different ways. But overall, that's one of those questions that's really kind of nuanced and specific to where somebody is. So exercise selection, number one, it has to be an exercise that truly does target the muscle that you're saying you want to develop, okay? And how do you know that you're targeting the muscle that you're really trying to develop? You probably need to have some proxies that tell you whether or not that's the case. And you should be able to feel the muscle under tension while you're performing the exercise. After you've done a set or 2 sets, you should feel some kind of a response from that muscle, like typically what bodybuilders would call a pump. And the following day or a couple of days after that, you should have some kind of tightness or soreness in that particular muscle. When you're trying to create exercise selection, it's really kind of based on the results that you're feeling and reporting back. How would you know that it's probably a bad exercise for you? Well, you're probably not having a very good muscle response subjectively while you're exercising. You know, you don't really feel that particular muscle under tension while you're exercising. It's not getting a good pump response during the session. You're sore elsewhere the next day, or you are starting to have a large amount of connective tissue soreness, or there's just an excessive amount of just general fatigue without the target muscle being really developed in the process. You know, it's almost like you're saying that you want to grow quads, and to do that, you're going to do 30-second sprints. And if you do a bunch of those, the next day you might wake up and feel like you got hit by a train. But, you know, that's just this generalized system fatigue rather than, you know, you chose to do a hack squat and the next day you get up and it's like your quads are very sore, but you don't have this general kind of like, you know, malaise and sluggishness as an organism. I think that, number one, people don't understand some of the fundamental kind of big picture principles that we talked about earlier. They don't understand specificity. They don't, like, if I'm trying to grow muscle tissue, I don't need to be going out and trying to run a half marathon. You know, I don't need to be trying to train explosively for plyometrics. I don't need to be doing things like Olympic lifts. People don't need to do a CrossFit-esque kind of a training regimen to grow muscle tissue. There's never been a competitive bodybuilder in the world that's primarily relied on CrossFit as their approach towards training. And those are things that are going to drain your adaptive energy. You'll have to recover from those other things to a really high degree, and that recovery energy can't be directed towards training energy for hypertrophy and accruing more and more volume over time. There's always a trade-off between the energy that's going towards growing tissue and the energy that's being directed towards simply recovering as an organism. So I think that that's a major concern. People just think if I work harder, then I'll get a response. But it has to be a very specific kind of work harder with a very targeted and organized approach towards figuring out some of those volume landmarks that I discussed earlier of how much do you actually have to do to be able to the least amount of work to grow tissue, and start there and successfully build up in a very systematic, diligent, organized approach where now we can ultimately figure out what's the end point for you. So I know the beginning, I know the end, I know the bookmark or the bookends that we're going to be able to work through, and ultimately trying to move those bookends up in a stairwise phenomenon over time so that we continue to be able to layer gains on in a long-term thought process perspective. So I don't think that people have a holistic model in their mind of what the correct approach is for being able to actually specifically target the adaptation that they're trying to get. And they'll kind of cross-contaminate other adaptations into the mix. The best way to grow muscle mass isn't to play competitive football, it's to train like a bodybuilder, are football players muscular? Yes, but it's not their primary goal. And if they were to stop playing football and train only as a bodybuilder, they would get even more, okay? So that's one. I think another one is that people don't really consider how much the nutrition element really plays into it. And if you're going to be growing muscle tissue, unless you are such an absolute beginner or are on such an unbelievably high amount of performance-enhancing drugs, you are not going to grow muscle tissue unless you're in a hypercaloric diet. And this is one that I've seen particularly come into play for a lot of women, where they'll be afraid to kind of spend enough time in a hypercaloric diet. It's like oftentimes they'll say things like they want to grow glute tissue, but they're afraid to be able to actually stay in a hypercaloric state and go on a true massing protocol. And, they're never going to get the adaptations that they're saying they want until they make that switch over. It's funny, a lot of times people will generally eat in either a hypocaloric state or in a maintenance state for most of the time out of fear that they're going to, get fat or start to look in a way that they don't want to. But they never put themselves in the state where they can support the training that's required to really grow muscle tissue. If you're eating at a maintenance level of calories, and you're trying to push yourself and actually grow muscle tissue, it's almost impossible to actually accomplish it. And you're going to work so hard for something that you can't have, which is psychologically devastating for most people. Imagine just continuing to work harder and harder at work, and your boss has been promising you a raise over time and you never get it. But you become bitter at that point. You feel like it's never going to happen and you lose faith in the process. But there was in fact a problem. There was like a hole in the boat and it's been leaking the whole time. You keep pouring more, water in or something, but it just keeps pouring out the other end because you're not supporting it with what needs to be in place physiologically to actually accomplish what you said you want. The easiest way to probably hurt yourself in training is through excessive load, okay? And if you hurt yourself in training, you're not going to be able to do what you need to do to grow muscle tissue. There's always a to-do list and a to-not-do list. And the major thing on the to-not-do list is don't get hurt and don't get sick, okay? Because if you get hurt or you get sick, you can't train. And if you can't train, first of all, even if you are continuing to train, you're probably not able to train hard enough to actually create the right kinds of adaptations. So you're probably working in a suboptimal manner just to get back up to the place. It's like you probably lost and you're working just to get back up to where you were for 4 weeks. Okay, then you're working where you were for the next 2 weeks. Now we're up to 6 weeks. Now you might begin to start making progress again. You know, you might be looking at an 8-week period before you start making progress. That's 2 months. You know, we're only talking about 12 months in a training year. If you're losing 2 out of 12, that's actually an enormous percentage. And people are consistently kind of doing things to themselves that are injuring themselves, causing themselves problems, going backwards, not able to just stay on a steady, progressive state that has appropriate plans and logistical points put in place so that you avoid the detractions and the detrimental things. So I think load, if I was gonna, you know, just make a guess here, I would say load is probably the most likely culprit for where people hurt themselves. And the reason is because they're probably not bringing themselves through a full range of motion. If they were doing good, solid, consistent reps through full range of motion, they would probably have to use less load. But the interesting thing is that you don't need that much load to create a hypertrophy response. It only needs to be between 30 and 85%. And the number of reps that you're doing doesn't even really matter that much as long as you're trying hard in the set and getting close to failure. I mean, you don't have to go 10 out of 10 on every set. You're probably not even as well served as you would be by consistently going 8.5 out of 10 on every set and increasing the number of sets that you're doing 8s or 8.5s on, you know? And if you're doing very good technical reps for every set that feature appropriate loading and full range of motion, with full range of motion, you're also stimulating the entire muscle tissue. You know, certain motor units are not even really recruited until the limb or the body is actually moving through a specific part of that range of motion. So if you're doing partials, you're recruiting only a small pool of motor units. And if you start going more and more range of motion, you're increasing the pool of motor units that you're training. And if you're going towards a state of approaching failure, you're going to be fatiguing all of the motor units, and you're going to be creating a broader spectrum of hypertrophy for the entire population of fibers for that muscle. So you're probably hitting more points on your to-do list and hitting more points on your to-not-do list by decreasing weight and increasing range of motion if your goal is to grow muscle tissue. Well, I think that people, like when I teach seminars on biomechanics, I basically teach it from the approach of saying, like, I only need you to become a McDonald's cash register employee, okay? And what I mean by that is the cashiers at McDonald's, they don't even press in numbers for the prices anymore. They hit a button that has a picture of the number 4 on the board. And then that inputs it into the system, and it sends the message to the back kitchen, and they load the fries into the thing, and they wrap the right burger, and they put it together in a bag, and they hand it to you. You get what you asked for in a very systematic, methodical kind of approach. You don't need to understand how the meat is made and how the buns are created. You just hit the button and you get the thing to come down the chute. And I try to organize all of my material into a very similar kind of a way. Now, I also, at the same time, I'm teaching these seminars to say, you can leave this seminar and be a McDonald's cashier and you can get the job done. Or you can become a high-end farm-to-table chef. And I'll basically tell you how the cow is raised and what it's fed and how to slaughter it and the whole deal. I'll give you the mechanisms. And if you understand the mechanisms, you can probably cook in a broader range of places and have a wider skill set. But even if you're a McDonald's cashier, you still have the ability to get the job done with most of the people that you're looking to feed. I don't need everyone to understand all the concepts. And if you don't want to understand all the concepts, all you have to do is basically plug the things in and coach them the way that I kind of recommend coaching them, and you'll ultimately get the job done. The other thing that I think is fairly interesting for people to see is the way that I train the people that I work with or the way that I train myself. And you might see things that look almost like any other personal training session. but the decisions behind why those things are put into place and the way that I coach, cue, and kind of guide the person through it is now that's the different thing. So in many ways, I don't really change what you do. I change how you do it and why you do it that way, okay? For instance, if you look around this gym, almost every piece of equipment was purchased in a very specific thought process, okay? There's a pendulum squat over to my right, and when I think about why that thing is so good, it's because it tips a person backwards and it takes all of the internal fluids from the body and it brings them to the posterior side of the body, okay? Which is going to take away the need for the person to manage the anterior rib cage while they're doing a squat exercise. There's so many people that are like, hey, the reason you can't squat to depth and do it correctly is your ankles, you don't have dorsiflexion. The likelihood that it's really an ankle phenomenon that's causing all those problems is slim to none. The likelihood that it's an inability to manage your center of mass at the level of the cervical cranial complex, thoraco-abdominal complex, and lumbo-pelvic femoral complex, that's probably a 99 out of 100 likelihood. When people lose control of their center of mass, of their axial skeleton, it almost always falls too far forward. If I can simply arrange you so that you're basically falling down a downhill, I take away all of that stuff, okay? And I basically get a perfect squat every single time. And I want the person to learn what that feels like over and over again for so many reps that I pattern that into their brain as their squat. So now when I introduce a more difficult state of managing gravity, now the only thing that their brain knows is the perfect representation of the squat pattern. And I can gradually kind of bring them to squatting in any number of different ways in terms of a bell in front of them, a bar in front of them, a bar behind them, a bar overhead. And the only thing that their brain knows is the original learning model, okay? And I don't necessarily need to bring everyone through all of those stages, but wherever I bring them in terms of the stage that supports their specific goals, the original model that they learned from is really good. I look at it the same way that I would look at teaching a kid how to shoot a basketball. I wouldn't start you off with a three-point shot. I wouldn't start you off with a half-court shot. I'd start you off with a layup, and I'd start you off using your legs properly. I'd start you off with lining your elbow up properly. I'd start you off with a follow-through that's done properly, and I would do a bunch of layups, and then gradually move you away and figure out approximately your ultimate shooting range for where you're most comfortable and effective. Same thing with exercise for me. I think that there is no exercise that is essential for people to have to do. I think that ultimately you have to, like, we all live in a very different kind of world than what our genes thought we would live in, okay? Our genes still think that we're probably gonna have to survive on the savannah in the wild, okay? We don't have to do that anymore. We live in an artificial, industrial complex kind of a world where the only thing you have to do to hunt is to take your phone and to hit a button and you get food brought to you, okay? So the only exercise that's really essential that you have to do is probably two things. It's probably consume calories and try to reproduce, okay? That's all biology really cares about, to tell you the truth. Consume, eliminate, and try to reproduce. Everything else is your biology trying to create these sophisticated ways that a human being is going to create the best billboard they possibly can to try to provide their genes to the next generation, which is a whole can of worms to get into. But ultimately, we don't have to do anything, quite honestly. We have really abstract goals that we use to try to move ourselves up into the most ideal position we can in a socio-hierarchical Western military industrial complex world that we live in, okay? And as a man, if I'm able to be financially successful, socially successful, and I look good and feel good from a way that my body looks perspective, I'm probably much more likely to have a positive psychological state, probably be able to, meet people that I could reproduce with, push my genes along to that next level, and overall feel as though I'm doing that which I like to do in life, okay? And whether or not I can do a third world squat and, do anything along those lines, it's really irrelevant in many ways to reality. Are those things potentially helpful if I have, if I have to live outdoors in the wild and push myself, or if I have to play professional sports or something along those lines? Yeah. But look, if like the highest demands that you have is you're a 55-year-old man and you barbecue on the weekend with your family, no. You need to have enough strength to be able to flip a burger and serve it to your son. Now it's just a question of what do you want to do? And once we figure out what you want, now we can begin to create a tailored and appropriate program to be able to guide you there. From a perspective of like how long can you live, that's a different story, okay? That's going to come down to your aerobic fitness more than anything else, okay? Your aerobic fitness, your body composition, and the amount of muscle tissue that you have on your frame. So if I have people that come in with no goals, I kind of build those in as your goals. How long can I get you to live and not become someone that becomes kind of like having comorbidities and other, sorts of really complicated medical conditions that you could go into. And the greatest defense against that is going to be an aerobic system, and you have to support the aerobic system with muscle mass and to avoid excess levels of body fat. Okay, so that really just comes down to basic kinds of training. We're going to lift in a style that's going to be approximating that which a bodybuilder would do. We're going to do cardio at a level that a bodybuilder would probably choose. And I'm going to try to get you to manage your food, not in a psychotic way. I don't need you to step on stage, but you should at least be somewhat cognizant of the fact that like you have to manage your intake so that you're not driving yourself towards an obesity state. In terms of growing muscle mass, I think that people need to understand, number one, the weight doesn't need to be excessively heavy. And you should have good technique and probably go more towards a full range of motion type of an exercise. Two, you don't need to be married to any particular exercise. The exercise itself is simply a tool that you use to try to target, train, and develop specific muscles on your body. And if you're picking exercises that are consistently causing you to experience pain and to experience excessive amounts of fatigue, those are probably bad choices, and there might be some other choices out there that don't cause those side effect consequences while still promoting the primary thing that you're looking for. Three, you need to be on a systematic program if you really want to do this. Like, exercise is something that falls into the domain of a scientific-based approach, and science is really kind of based on progress and being able to measure things and increase those measurements in the right direction over time. And if you make inappropriate amounts of changes, either upwards or downwards, in the amount of measured volume that you're accruing with your body, you're probably not setting yourself up for success. And if you're starting to not experience success, that can put you in a very negative mental space, especially if you're working hard. Nobody likes to work hard and not get results. People usually quit when that's the case. Fourth, I would say that if you're not aware of how the nutrition is impacting the potential changes that your body is going to go through, then you're probably going to, again, be going into a place where you're not getting results and you're going to go into a negative mental space. If you're actively trying to grow muscle tissue, you have to be in a hypercaloric state. If you're actively trying to lose body fat, you have to be in a hypocaloric state. You can't be in the middle and expect change to happen. And you can't just oscillate back and forth between those two things during the same week. You have to have very specific points of weeks at a time, months at a time that you dedicate towards a muscle gaining phase or you dedicate towards a fat loss phase to be able to actually have results from that particular thing. And it needs to be, again, planned, measured, and driven progressively over time. That which causes you to lose fat in the beginning of a diet may not be that which causes you to lose fat at the end of a diet. And if you're not monitoring, measuring, and altering appropriately, you're probably going to, again, stagnate, stop getting results, give up, quit, and you're going to feel very frustrated in the process. Fifth, I would say that most people probably need to have some coach or accountability partner. I think that most people need to stay on these things for long term, decades, if not life, okay? We need social support for those kinds of things as an animal. We're a tribal-based animal. We're not individual loner kinds of beings. You can become very unhappy if you're consistently lacking any kind of social support or someone that you can have as a partner in crime, so to speak. So I would very much recommend having someone that you're working with that is a positive person that can really encourage you and really be there as also someone that's in it with you, that you have as, you know, hey, if you're doing this, I'm doing this. Yeah, I really think that there's some great resources out there when it comes to training and hypertrophy. Like my go-to people would be the Renaissance periodization people. I think Mike Israetel just does a really fantastic job of being able to organize information, present it in a very clear, logical, and sequential manner. He also lives the life, and he has a very strong background in terms of the body and knowledge. So I think that if you start there, you're going to have more than you could ever want in terms of information coming your way. And I personally really utilize their information as well as their diet app to be able to kind of help me on my own goals. So I would definitely recommend them. In addition to them, I think that Jordan Shallow and Eugene Teo, they do a really good job, and they have great videos and clear instructional stuff that I think is very, very helpful for people. But, you know, I'm mentioning only a couple of people. There's probably, like Lane Norton is also someone that's absolutely fantastic with a great scientific background and, you know, just has lived this lifestyle and understands every piece that's involved with it for a long time. So I think that those are some great resources that will have really almost limitless amounts of information for people to dig into.